What if Earth once knew something and forgot? Wherever you are tonight, I'm glad you're here. Let's drift together into a time before the word time was spoken, before blue, before oceans, before silence even knew its name. The planet was not yet a planet as we know it. It was a body still finding its own boundaries, half light, half molten breath. Every moment trembled, every horizon burned. The air was not air but vapor, dense and alive, swirling with the size of newborn stone. It was the Hadean Earth, a word humans would whisper billions of years later. But back then, there were no names, only the low exhale of magma cooling and the first uncertain condensation of memory itself. Steam rose like thought from the mind of the planet, curled, fell, and rose again, each plume a question the Earth was asking itself. What does it mean to cool? What does it mean to become? Rain did not yet fall as comfort. It hissed against stone, shattered on contact, evaporated into the same red haze that birthed it. But in that cycle of appearing and vanishing, a rhythm was forming. The planet was learning to breathe. Sometimes, in the deep of night, scientists still trace isotopes through rock and say, "Here, this zircon crystal. This is where the water first touched." They say it with instruments and equations, but what they are really hearing is a whisper, a memory pressed into mineral, of a time when the whole world was both wound and healing. In that infancy, light could not reach the surface unbroken. The sky was heavy, thick with volcanic size, a roof of ash where stars were only rumors, lightning stitched across it in white veins, brief and ancient, igniting oceans that were not yet oceans. Hydrogen met oxygen, an impossible marriage, born from fire, surviving through absence. Imagine it, the sound of no birds, no wind, only thermal breath, a planet wrapped in itself, warming and cooling in the same motion, like the inhale and exhale of something just beginning to dream. Water had been locked inside minerals since the dawn of this sphere, trapped from the time when cosmic dust gathered to form solidity. But nothing can remain buried forever. Heat split open those cages of stone, and the vapor escaped, not as rivers, not as rain, but as release. The Earth was remembering what it carried within. Each molecule was a traveler, a wanderer from the interstellar nursery where all things began. They fell together, they rose together, in endless cycles of creation that knew neither success nor failure. Only repetition, only rhythm. The oceans were being written before they existed. In every droplet there was prophecy. In every hiss of steam there was longing. Even before there was blue, there was intention. This is how all beginnings unfold. Not in brilliance, but in exhaustion. The planet, weary of burning, began to cool, and in that cooling found grace. Some say that to form water is to create time, that when matter condenses, when gas slows enough to reflect light, something eternal begins to count. If that's true, then this is where time first opened its eyes. The world, newly born, was already ancient in its silence, every moment layered upon the next, like mist settling on still embers. No sound, no light, just the steady pulse of a sphere finding its shape. And somewhere, beneath the fog, the memory of steam gathered. It waited not for life, not for purpose, but for reflection. the kind that can only come when a surface becomes calm enough to mirror the sky. But the sky was not yet ready to be seen. It burned with orange clouds of carbon and iron dust, a twilight that never ended. The stars hid, patient as always. They knew that even in darkness, the story of light continues. The earth exhaled again. Steam rose in veils, folding over itself, and for the first time, it began to rain, truly rain. Not for seconds, but for centuries. Not in storms, but in memory. Drops fell through miles of atmosphere, each one losing itself before it ever reached the ground. Yet somehow some drops survived. They kissed the stone, hissed, and stayed. They gathered, trembled, and formed the first pools of stillness. It was not yet the ocean, but it was its thought, and like all thoughts, it began as vapor, soft, persistent, unseen by anyone, but felt by everything. Time doesn't pass, it settles, and here in the settling, the world began to cool enough to dream. The rain did not fall as mercy. It fell as persistence, a quiet insistence that even fire must one day surrender. For thousands of years that felt like one long sigh, droplets danced upon rock that still glowed beneath its surface. Each one disappeared in a breath of vapor, and yet each left behind a mark no human eye would ever see. The earth was slowly being sculpted by absence, a cooling too gradual for memory, a transformation too patient for sound. Volcanoes opened their throats to the heavens, releasing the last of what the planet had hidden. Out poured carbon, sulfur, and steam, ghosts of the planet's birth, unwilling to vanish without ceremony. In the spaces between eruptions, silence gathered. Not the silence of still air, but the kind that feels like waiting, waiting for equilibrium, waiting for reflection. Scientists, long after, would call this the Great Condensation Epoch, the time when the sky finally began to release its burden. But such language is too clean for what truly happened. It wasn't a process. It was a yearning. The earth longed to cool itself, to remember what rest might feel like. Somewhere in that unending rainfall, the first true pools began to form. Not lakes, not seas, but mirrors. They shimmered over cracked basalt, thin as breath, fleeting as dew in flame. And yet within them, something eternal stirred. The water was not pure, carried the taste of the planet. Iron, sulfur, ash, the minerals of fire now dissolved in their own undoing. Every droplet became a message from deep within the crust, rising to tell the surface what it had endured. If one could have stood there, though no creature yet existed to bear witness, they would have seen a world half-born, wrapped in glowing fog, its horizon a smear of orange and black. Mountains rose only to melt again. Islands floated on seas of magma, sinking back into the warmth that made them. It was a planet in conversation with itself. Heat speaking to water, water answering in steam. The cycle became rhythm. The rhythm became memory. Rain fell, hissed, rose and fell again. And with each repetition, the crust cooled a little more. In time, long beyond what minds could imagine, those thin films of liquid gathered strength. They found one another, merged, deepened, spread. Soon the cracks between continents became veins of shimmering blue-gray. Not yet the ocean, but its outline. The sound would have been unearthly, a planet breathing through boiling water, an orchestra of sizzle and sigh. No wind, no thunder, only the heartbeat of condensation, the sound of creation, slowed to near stillness. There was peace in it, though nothing alive was yet there to feel it. Peace is not always a feeling. Sometimes it is an inevitability. Fire must tire, stone must cool, and steam must fall. Above this quiet chaos, the clouds began to thin. The orange veil lifted just enough for light to pierce through in scattered rays. For the first time, sunlight touched a surface of water, and did not evaporate it instantly. A shimmer spread across the liquid like recognition, as if the earth was seeing itself for the very first time. This was the beginning of reflection, the first mirror, the first stillness, and though there were no eyes, something unseen began to perceive. Perhaps perception does not require life. Perhaps it begins with the universe noticing itself. In that first reflection, something ancient awoke. Not consciousness, not yet, but potential. The oceans to be swayed faintly under gravity's slow pull, as if rocked by an invisible hand. The moon had already formed, torn from Earth's own flesh in an earlier collision. Now it began to tug gently, introducing rhythm into chaos. For the first time, the planet had a pulse. In the language of geology, this was simply cooling, accretion, and condensation. But in the language of silence, it was grace, a molten world learning how to hold itself still enough to dream. The rains eased, steam rose in thinner veils, and the first proto-oceans deepened into memory. Each droplet that once vanished into heat was now part of something vast, something that could last. Time flowed differently now, slower, steadier. The world, once aflame, had begun to whisper, and the whisper said, "Let there be calm." Calm did not arrive all at once. It drifted in, like mist remembering where to rest. The world had stopped burning, but the warmth beneath its surface still glowed. A faint heartbeat, steady and patient, pulsed below the new oceans. Everywhere, heat rose through fissures in the crust, threads of crimson breath weaving through the deep. Water met magma, hissed, surrendered, returned again. An eternal conversation of cooling and renewal. This was when the earth began to sound less like chaos, and more like sleep, a quiet rhythm beneath the violence, a slow pulse that could lull even stars into reflection. The first lullaby of a planet that had finally learned to breathe. The oceans were thick then, dense with vapor and minerals, their color uncertain, their light muted by haze. Yet within that stillness, structure was forming. Pressure gathered. Currents began to coil. The planet was beginning to move not through eruptions, but through flow. Steam drifted upward and lingered in the dim air. It hung there like memory that refused to dissolve, a soft veil between the surface and the waiting sky. It shimmered under a dull sun, turning light into liquid. Everything reflected everything else. Stone mirrored water, water mirrored cloud, cloud mirrored fire, and somewhere in the depths, the first whispers of chemistry began their quiet exchange. Molecules danced, parted, rejoined, not yet life, but something like rehearsal. The sea was practicing memory. It was here that temperature became teacher. The heat beneath reminded the water of its origin. The cold above reminded it of its destiny. Between them, movement. Between movement, story. Scientists would later call this balance the cradle of possibility. But in truth, it was something simpler, a natural rhythm returning to its own breath. Each wave, each droplet, each hiss of condensation was an act of remembrance. The planet had known fire for too long. Now it was learning surrender. The sky, still orange with carbon and ash, began to thin further. It was tired of holding so much. Every molecule of vapor that condensed into rain lightened the atmosphere's burden. Slowly, light began to find its way through, not harsh and direct, but diffused, like the memory of a star. And for the first time, the world glowed instead of burned. Imagine that glow, not sunlight, not firelight, but a quiet luminescence of balance. A world between states, half storm, half peace. It was beauty without witness, but beauty all the same. The crust beneath the oceans thickened. Continents, small and scattered, began to rise from the waves like thoughts forming out of dream. They were rough, dark, volcanic. Yet, on their surfaces, water pooled in hollows, traced lines down their slopes, and began to write the first sentences of erosion. Erosion, the Earth's handwriting, the language of patience, each drop a word, each stream a phrase. Through this endless repetition, mountains softened, valleys opened, and the surface of the world became fluent in change. The oceans deepened further. Steam no longer ruled the sky. It had descended, become part of the planet's skin. Now the air shimmered with clarity, and though it still held heat and haze, it began to know color. Blue was not born in a single instant. It appeared like forgiveness, slowly, gently, through layers of transparency. The same light that once scattered through dust and sulfur now danced freely upon open water, and the planet, for the first time, had a sky worth reflecting. Reflection became ritual. Every sunrise painted the sea in memory. Every night, the dark sky returned its silence, and between them, Earth continued to cool, to soften, to breathe. The memory of steam remained, echoing through every ripple, whispering that creation is never finished, only paused between breaths. The world was not done becoming, but it had learned calm. It had learned rhythm. It had learned the art of stillness. And in that stillness, it waited for something new to arrive, something invisible, fragile, and unthinkably patient, something that would rise, not from fire this time, but from water. Beneath the soft shimmer of this new calm, the earth began to dream in deeper tones. The crust cooled enough to hold form, and the oceans deepened into a memory that could not be undone. Steam no longer ruled the air, but its ghost lingered in every breath of wind, in every sigh that rose from the warm seabed. Far below the surface, the molten heart still murmured. Rivers of heat wound through the mantle, carving invisible paths that would one day become continents. When they rose, they would not rise with violence, but with the slow patience of time breathing. The world no longer shouted. It whispered. The oceans, though still restless, had learned to hold themselves. Their surface quivered with faint movement, the first tides responding to the pull of their distant twin, the moon. Once torn from Earth's side, the moon now circled like a patient guardian, her pale face stirring gentle ripples across the dark sea. She did not yet shine the way she would in future ages. The atmosphere still softened her light, but she was there, and her rhythm became the planet's pulse. Night and day were not yet clear distinctions. The horizon carried the same low amber glow whether sun or moon reigned. Yet the rhythm of shadow and light began to matter. It taught the oceans to breathe differently, to rise, to fall, to rest. Water, once enslaved by heat, was now guided by gravity and grace. And deep within those darkened depths, a strange chemistry began to unfold. Not life, not yet, but patterns that echoed life's shape.
Molecules separated, again.
Drawn by invisible rules written long before the earth existed. Energy whispered through minerals, and structure began to remember itself. Perhaps this was the true beginning of memory, not in creatures, but in matter itself learning repetition. Every current, every drop, every dissolved grain of salt was a lesson in persistence. The world was still too young to think, but it had begun to remember. Volcanoes rose like breathing marks between water and sky. Their smoke no longer smothered the world, but blended with the mist. Fire speaking gently with water, no longer enemies, but ancient companions in dialogue. Each eruption seeded the ocean with minerals, with gifts from the deep interior. Iron, carbon, sulfur. The language of elements began its first syntax. From that chemistry, color slowly awakened. The sea grew darker, not from shadow, but from density. Each new particle absorbed light. Each wave reflected a softer hue. Blue deepened, gray sighed, and the first dusk over water felt like peace itself taking form. If the earth could speak in that moment, it would not have used words. It would have sung. A low, resonant hum through the crust and sea. A vibration older than language. A lullaby to itself. Time stretched like silk across this slow unfolding. 1,000,000 years passed like a single exhalation. Mountains formed, dissolved, and formed again. The surface shifted, but the oceans stayed. They were the memory that refused to fade. Steam had become rain, rain had become sea, and the sea had become permanence. Even now, every wave carries that first memory, that long fall from vapor into form. Every droplet is a fragment of that ancient rain, reborn through endless cycles of evaporation and return. The water we touch today has touched the first stone, has kissed the first flame, has fallen through the first orange sky. It remembers everything, even if it says nothing. And as the earth cooled into quiet, the first real silence descended. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of stillness, the kind that exists before thought, before awakening. That silence is where creation hides. And in that silence, the earth waited, waited for light to become color, waited for chemistry to become life, waited for memory to find a body. The steam that once covered the planet had finally condensed into the oceans of possibility. What was once heat had become harmony. What was once violence had become reflection. And what was once chaos had learned the gentleness of rhythm. The world had cooled enough to hold a dream. And within that dream, something small began to stir. a pattern that did not yet know its name. It trembled quietly in the dark, content simply to exist, as if waiting for time to catch up with it. The memory of steam had ended, but not its echo. It lived on in every breath of mist, in every droplet that returned to the sea. Even now, when clouds gather and rain falls upon ancient rock, the earth remembers its first lullaby, the song that turned fire into water and silence into sound. But what the planet buried, it never truly forgot. Before there were continents, before any land dared to rise from the deep, there was only water, vast, unbroken, and endless. It stretched in every direction, not yet blue, not yet green, but a dark mirror catching the faintest glow from the newborn sky. This was the age of the nameless oceans. No wind yet traced patterns on their surface. No creature disturbed their quiet rhythm. The world was not empty. It was waiting. The moon's pull had grown stronger by then. Her orbit steadied, her face brightened, and she began to sculpt the water with invisible hands. The tides, once hesitant, now found their motion. They rose and fell with quiet devotion, breathing in time with the sky. Each movement was practice, a rehearsal for the rhythms that would one day sustain life. At the ocean floor, dark ridges of molten stone curved across the planet. They glowed faintly beneath miles of water, weaving through the crust like veins of fire. The sea above them hissed and whispered, its weight pressing down with ancient patience. In that quiet pressure, minerals dissolved and reformed, and the chemistry of becoming continued. Hydrothermal vents exhaled softly, their breath warm and rich with mystery. Columns of minerals rose like towers in the dark, white and black and glimmering faintly in their own heat. There was no light here, only the slow pulse of energy meeting matter. Yet within that darkness, something astonishing began to occur. Tiny chains of molecules, born from chance and heat, began to align themselves. They curled, folded, and reached. No mind guided them, no purpose drove them, but the laws of nature themselves were generous architects. Each reaction left a trace, each trace taught the next, and in that repetition, order began to take root. It was not life yet, but it was the whisper of it. Imagine the stillness, a black ocean floor, the weight of miles of water, and somewhere in that quiet, the first pattern that could copy itself. So small it would be invisible even to future eyes. Yet it was enough to start a chain that would never end. The oceans, though silent, were not indifferent. Their currents began to move slowly, guided by heat and gravity. Every motion mixed the world a little more, spreading minerals, blending possibilities. The sea became a living workshop, a mindless, tireless artist. Above, the sky still wore its golden haze. The sun shone dimly through layers of vapor, and the days glowed like warm dusk. There were no true stars visible yet.
No crispados.
No blue sky, only a soft, eternal twilight. But through that veil, the young world learned balance. It was neither burning nor frozen. It had found its middle place. Sometimes the ocean boiled near the vents. Sometimes it froze near the poles. But always it returned to stillness. That rhythm became the heartbeat of the planet. In this endless sea, No name could yet exist. Names require memory, and memory requires a witness. The earth remembered, but it had no one to tell. Still, every wave that touched another was a kind of introduction. Every current that circled back was a kind of greeting. The world was learning to speak in motion, and slowly, what had been chemistry began to sound more like intention. Molecules met not just by accident, but by pattern. They formed shapes that lasted longer, shapes that remembered how to become again. The oceans held them, cradled them in warmth and darkness, as if protecting a secret that even the stars didn't know. If the planet had eyes, it might have watched in awe, for from silence, something was about to sing. At first, the oceans were perfectly still. They were mirrors to the clouds, their surfaces like glass remembering heat. But stillness cannot hold forever. Even silence seeks to move. And so, the oceans began to breathe. It started softly, a tremor beneath the crust, the slow exhalation of gases once trapped in stone.
Carbon met water.
Hydrogen met light, and the thin balance between nothing and something began to tilt. Tiny films of oily matter floated on the surface, each one catching sunlight like a skin of gold. Within them, strange reactions stirred, circles of energy spinning in miniature storms. The sea, once an observer, had become an instrument of creation. Each shimmer carried a small inheritance of memory. Each ripple, a rehearsal of life. No creature yet stirred, no eyes yet opened, but the oceans pulsed as if something within them was learning to inhale. The sky, still copper and thick, drifted with clouds of ash and steam. Lightning danced over the horizon, its light mirrored in the water below. Each strike was a promise, each thunder a reminder that the earth was not quiet by nature, only learning patience. In those brief flashes, energy crossed the divide between sky and sea, kissed the surface, and vanished into depth. Somewhere in the shadows of that exchange, atoms learned to hold hands. Hydrogen whispered to nitrogen, carbon shaped its quiet chains. And from that dance, fragile networks began to form. They were not yet cells. They were not yet alive. But they were possible. The oceans swelled with them, a million beginnings suspended in darkness. The planet, in its infancy, became a womb. Deep currents rolled like sighs beneath the surface. They traveled from hot vents to frozen shallows, carrying whispers of what they had seen. The chemistry changed as they moved, a slow alchemy guided by pressure and patience. The sea was experimenting, and it never tired. Every wave that broke was another attempt at memory. Every molecule that drifted apart made room for the next to meet. There was no failure here, only the slow rhythm of trying. Above, the moon traced her silver path, her pull carving tides that drew the ocean's breath. In and out, rise and fall, the first inhale of a living world. From the ocean floor, faint plumes shimmered upward, trailing mineral snow into the darkness. They drifted for miles before settling again. Soft, silent rain that fed the unseen reactions below. Each flake carried secrets: sulfur, iron, phosphorus, the alphabet of existence. The oceans were writing something in that dark, a long, patient sentence, whose meaning would take eons to speak. There are moments in every story where silence does more than sound ever could. This was one of them, for in this stillness, before motion became life, the earth was listening to itself. Every vibration, every ripple, was the planet learning its own name. If a traveler could have floated there, above those nameless waters, they would have seen nothing. No islands,
No down.
only the curve of an endless sea, glowing faintly beneath a dim red sun. But beneath that emptiness, everything was happening. The world's first conversations, not in words, but in patterns, in the way one reaction echoed another, in the way heat sought cold, and stillness turned to motion. The oceans were alive in spirit. Long before life itself began, they were the first memory keepers, holding the blueprint of everything to come. And so the world breathed, and in that breath, the seed of time began to grow. Salt was the first memory the oceans ever held. Not a sound, not a shape, but a taste, a trace of stone dissolved in patience. It was the mark of what the planet had given up, and what the sea promised to remember. Every drop carried the memory of mountains not yet born. Every current traced the ghost of a continent still sleeping in the deep. Salt became time's first language, its crystals storing the whispers of vanished heat. To touch that ancient water would be to touch the earliest thought, the world's own recollection of itself. Shadow came next. When the first clouds thickened above the sea, light became a visitor rather than a ruler. It bent and broke in the vapor, sinking through miles of liquid amber, before vanishing into the black. And in that quiet dark, the oceans found their mind. The surface glittered, but the heart of the sea lived in shadow. Here pressure replaced gravity, and silence grew so deep it could almost be heard. Particles drifted like dust in an ancient room. Heat glowed faintly at the edges of unseen ridges. The deep learned to dream. When salt met shadow, something new was born, an equilibrium that no storm could undo. It was as if the oceans understood that to endure, they must hold both memory and mystery. Every tide was an act of remembering, every wave a rehearsal of forgetting. The moon watched. Her reflection rippled across the surface, broken and rejoined with every motion. Her pull gathered water across the skin of the planet, drawing it like breath across a sleeping body. The tides became the Earth's pulse, a steady rhythm to remind the sea that it was still alive. No life yet stirred within it, no voice yet called back. But the conditions for both were nearly perfect. Iron seeped through cracks in the crust. Sulfur curled through chimneys of stone. And in that chemical twilight, the first fragile patterns began to last longer than chance should allow. Some clung to minerals. Some drifted free, spinning through invisible currents like pollen. Each one an echo of what might come next. Time to them meant nothing. They neither lived nor died. They simply were, suspended between becoming and being. And yet, from their stillness, the first hint of motion with purpose began to emerge. It was faint, like a heartbeat through layers of stone. But it grew. The oceans had become a cradle, and the world itself was the parent. Heat, gravity, minerals, light, each a caretaker in its own way, each tending the fragile rhythm of possibility. And the salt kept count. Salt, after all, remembers every evaporation, every return of rain. It is the diary of water. When the first storms raged, and they did with thunder that shook the sky itself, the salt endured. It dissolved, reformed, and carried the record of that violence calmly in its chemistry. It knew that even destruction had meaning, that every flood was also a kind of creation. In this way, the sea learned forgiveness. Each wave erased what came before, but not completely. A trace always remained, a thin residue of memory that clung to the shorelines that did not yet exist. This was how the oceans began to think. Not in thoughts, but in tides. They would remember the sky's anger, the stone's surrender, and the quiet after every storm. They would remember long after the world forgot. And one day, when life finally rose to meet them, the oceans would teach memory to all who listened. For water never forgets. It only learns to move differently. Beneath the horizon, the light faded once more, and the world exhaled in mist and rain. Salt and shadow drifted together, two halves of the same silence. And somewhere within that silence, a single chain of molecules folded, as if in prayer. The ocean kept that secret. It still does. At last, light found a way through. It was faint, uncertain, a soft haze falling through the copper clouds, glimmering across the endless expanse of water. It did not illuminate the sea, caressed it, as if afraid to wake something ancient still dreaming below. The light that reached the surface was different from the sun we know. It was filtered through a veil of vapor and ash, muted into a golden melancholy. Each beam broke apart in the steam, fracturing into 1,000 soft reflections. The oceans shimmered like molten glass. No creatures rose to greet it. No eyes blinked in recognition. Yet something in the water changed. Energy touched matter, and the balance between night and day began its endless rhythm. For the first time, shadows had direction. The ocean's face became a map of contrast. Light above, dark below. The planet had discovered its depth. In that gentle illumination, the chemistry of existence began to bloom. Sunlight became a message the molecules could read. Certain reactions awakened when it arrived and rested when it left. In the silent language of physics, time had begun to speak in color. Each morning, if such a word could exist yet, the oceans shimmered faintly, their surfaces rippling with light that remembered warmth. And each long dusk, as the sun sank into haze, the water glowed faintly from within, as if refusing to let the light go completely. Even then, the sea understood loss. It held on to what touched it, and in holding, it changed. The clouds thinned slowly over millions of years. Volcanoes calmed, their breath less furious. Rain fell more gently now, not in endless sheets but in rhythms. Between the downpours, light found longer windows of peace. The sky, once bronze and heavy, paled toward blue. And for the first time in the universe's long story, color touched water in truth. It was a blue not yet seen anywhere, deep, imperfect, filled with whispers of iron and dust. It shimmered not with brightness, but with depth, a blue that meant memory, not clarity. The oceans drank the light, and in doing so, they became storytellers. Each photon that entered was a visitor from the sun's distant heart, having traveled for 8 silent minutes through nothingness, to touch this new, waiting world. When it struck the water, it split, some to heat, some to motion, some to chemistry. The light became part of the ocean's endless experiment. And beneath the surface, the shadows responded. They stretched, reached, danced with the light's fading edges. Every flicker became a rhythm, every rhythm a heartbeat. The deep was not lifeless anymore. It was listening. The oceans had learned how to breathe. Now they were learning how to dream in color. Above, the moon kept time. Her silver face grew cooler, her orbit more graceful. She sculpted the tides with precision, teaching the oceans to sway like a pulse that could never stop. Her light too touched the sea, cold, slow, like the memory of daylight. Together, the sun and moon began their eternal duet, each lighting the ocean in their own language. Day spoke in gold, night whispered in silver, and the sea, always listening, held both truths. If silence could shimmer, it would sound like that. A world half-born, bathed in half-light, every glimmer a question, every reflection a thought unfinished. The first forms of life were still invisible, their beginnings too fragile, too quiet for sight, but they followed the rhythm of this new light, drifting toward warmth, retreating from dark, learning instinctively that contrast was survival. Thus began the oldest dialogue in existence, between light and shadow, between day and the deep, a conversation that continues even now, in every cell, in every breath, in every turning of the tides. And some did. They lingered in the warmth, clinging to mineral walls, learning to use the energy that surrounded them. Slowly, impossibly, the first true boundaries formed, cells in their simplest, most elegant form. The cradle beneath the waves had succeeded. Life, in its quietest infancy, had begun to breathe. No light reached this place, only heat, pressure, and patience. But even without the sun, something like purpose began to stir. Each cell replicated not by command, but by chance made stable. Each division left a trace behind, and those traces began to multiply. The ocean floor, once bare and silent, was now dusted with invisible persistence. It looked no different to the naked eye, the same black stone, the same drifting particles, but something profound had changed. The earth had found its heartbeat. Above, the surface churned in storms of cloud and lightning. The young world still wore chaos like a crown. But deep beneath, life continued its unhurried rhythm, untouched by rage, devoted only to repetition. It was as if the planet's violence had a counterbalance. The calm beneath, the patience of the unseen. When these first cells divided, the ocean took note, carried them, scattered them, hid them in crevices and currents. The sea became both mother and messenger, spreading the pattern it had birthed. And in every corner of its darkness, the same fragile miracle repeated, not perfectly, but enough. This was the beginning of inheritance, the first idea to pass itself forward, the first whisper that would echo across ages. Each copy slightly changed, each change slightly wiser. The sea had discovered time not as erosion, but as growth. The cradle beneath the waves rocked gently with the tides. The moon's pull reached even here, pressing, releasing, guiding the rhythm of division. The earth and the sea and the sky had begun their long symphony, one that would never end, only change its melody. If one could listen closely enough, through miles of silence and pressure, the sound would be soft, like breathing through stone, like a lullaby sung by water itself. This was the ocean's first song, and all of life would learn its tune. The sea, once silent, now murmured, not in words, not in music, but in rhythms too deep for ears. Pressure met motion, motion met heat, and together they wove a vibration that passed through the planet's bones. It was the first resonance of life, the sound of existence rehearsing itself. Each microscopic cell, though blind and mindless, moved in tune with the others. They drifted together like dust in sunlight, rising, falling, finding balance in the invisible sway of currents. Their presence changed the water's chemistry, a delicate shift that no storm could erase. The sea was alive now, though it did not yet know what that meant. If the ocean had a voice, it would have been slow, measured, and kind. It would have spoken in vibrations carried through salt and shadow, a hymn of quiet persistence. And perhaps the stone listened, perhaps even the deep crust, once deaf to the surface, felt the trembling of new creation above it. This music of beginnings had no melody, only pattern, the pattern of repetition, of division, of return. It was a lullaby written in chemistry. Each cycle, each replication, a note added to the silent score of time. At the surface, the world remained restless. Thunder still rolled. The moon still drew tides like breath across the planet's skin. Lightning split the clouds, and each flash echoed through the water, a distant drumbeat for those hidden lives below. They did not see the light, but they felt its arrival in warmth and pulse. Even the smallest organism responded to that distant rhythm, turning, shifting, as though guided by something ancient and invisible. The sea began to sing in cycles. Upwelling currents lifted nutrients from the depths, feeding what the darkness had created. Downwelling streams carried the remains back again, a circulation of memory. In this endless exchange, death and birth were not opposites. They were mirrors. Every ending dissolved softly into another beginning. The sound of the living sea was not a song but a breath, a single inhale drawn over centuries. The ocean held it, as if afraid to exhale too soon. In this rhythm, the first ecosystems formed, though they were invisible to the naked eye. Bacteria gathered around vents, drawing nourishment from minerals instead of sunlight. They built communities without sight or voice, each dependent on the heat that seeped from Earth's interior. These colonies became gardens of invisible fire, thriving in the dark where nothing else dared to be. Their world was harsh but consistent, the same temperature, the same pressure, the same hum of creation. Every moment was both a birth and a test. Yet somehow, this fragile balance endured. The sea's heartbeat grew steadier. Above, the sky's storms began to wane. The great rains slowed. The air cleared just enough for light to stay longer each day. The line between day and night sharpened, and with that precision, the ocean's rhythm aligned to the turning of the planet itself. The tides became time, the waves became memory, and life learned to measure itself by them. Each molecule that moved now carried the history of all that came before. The pattern had been set: survival through balance, existence through adaptation. It was not a lesson taught, it was a truth absorbed. The sea had written it in the language of atoms, and everything that would ever live would learn to read it. There were no witnesses, no gods to name the moment, only water and light, gravity and patience. Yet in that quiet, the earth crossed an invisible threshold. It was no longer only a world of elements. It had become a world of processes, of continuity, of sound that meant something. And if the stars had listened, perhaps they would have recognized the melody. It was the same pattern they carried in their own burning hearts: expansion, collapse, renewal. The song of existence itself, echoing now within the body of a single blue planet. The sound of the living sea was not meant to be heard. It was meant to be felt, by stone, by moonlight, by everything that would one day rise from its depths. Even now, when the waves break against distant shores, the echo of that ancient hum remains. It lingers in the undertow, in the rhythm of tides, in the hush between breaths, the same slow vibration that once awakened the world, still whispers beneath every ocean skin. And as night fell again upon that newborn world, the sea, alive, aware, unhurried, rocked itself to sleep. It dreamed not of what it was, but of what it might become. For a long time, the sky did not know how to hold its own light. It shimmered, flickered, and vanished again, a restless mirror of the sea below. The clouds hung low, thick as forgotten dreams, their bellies glowing faintly with the memory of lightning. Each flash carved a brief eternity across the firmament, and then the darkness returned, gentle, patient, as if waiting for the world to be ready. But readiness was not a thing the earth could feel yet. It simply moved forward, pulled by forces older than hope. Volcanoes breathed quietly now, their fury replaced by slow exhalations of steam. The air, once poison, was thinning into possibility.
Hydrogen met oxygen. Oxygen met patience.
And from that patience came something the world had never seen before: clarity. The first clear morning on Earth did not arrive all at once. It unfolded, like a curtain drawn one thread at a time. The clouds lifted, uncertain, revealing not blue, for the color blue had yet to exist, but depth, a vastness that stretched without border, that dared to let the light stay. The sun rose slowly that day, its rays no longer scattered into chaos. They entered the air cleanly, cutting through the mist, painting the sea in tones it had never worn: gold, silver, something like grace. The world was still rough, scarred by its creation, but for the first time could see itself. And in that seeing, something stirred again in the ocean. The cells that had learned to live without light now began to sense a rhythm beyond the waves. Some moved upward, drawn not by need but by curiosity, the quiet curiosity written into all things that endure. They rose slowly through layers of shadow and salt, each one carrying a piece of the deep's memory. When they reached the surface, the light greeted them not as warmth, but as revelation. It entered them, split them, changed them, taught them to eat light, and in doing so, it taught them to make air. The sky, once heavy and waiting, finally breathed. Oxygen spilled upward, delicate and invisible, until the air began to shimmer with a faint blue hue. That was how color arrived, as the byproduct of survival. The sun burned steadily, the moon kept watch, and together they wrote the rhythm of time itself. Day and night became more than darkness and dawn. They became the world's first language. Light meant motion, dark meant rest. Each cycle, a conversation between sky and sea. The clouds learned to listen too. They gathered where the water rose warm, and they wept where it cooled. Rain became memory falling back home. Every drop carried whispers of salt, of sunlight, of time. And below, the ocean's children changed again. Some learned to follow the light, to rise and fall with its coming. Others hid in the depths, keeping the secrets of the dark. Life had discovered duality, and in that duality, the story began to branch. The earth now wore a face, blue, white, soft gold at the edges, a fragile balance between chaos and calm, turned slowly, almost shyly, as if showing itself to the sun for the first time. The stars, silent witnesses, watched the transformation without envy. They had always known that light's greatest act was not to burn, but to stay. The sky, having waited so long, finally knew stillness. It no longer fought to keep the light out. It held it, cradled it, let it pass gently from day into night. The wind learned softness, the rain learned rhythm, and for the first time, the planet dreamed in color. It was not yet a world of sound or speech, but of harmony, a balance so precise it could almost be mistaken for silence. Every molecule of air, every shimmer of wave, was part of the same quiet understanding, that to endure, one must both hold and release. The sea exhaled oxygen. The sky returned rain. The cycle was complete. Life had given something back to the world that birthed it. And in the deep, where no light yet reached, the old cells listened. They could feel the change above them, the soft tug of brighter tides, the faint taste of new air dissolving through the water. The world was becoming layered now, filled with gradients of color, temperature, and time. It was no longer a single place, but 1,000 worlds sharing one heartbeat. As dusk fell again, the light retreated, but not completely. It left traces, afterglows, reflections, soft warmth that lingered on the water's skin, promised to return. And the sea believed it. The sky had waited too long, but now it understood its purpose. It was not merely to cover the earth, but to carry its breath, to hold the story between stars and sea. The world slept that night beneath its first true sky, no longer hidden, no longer waiting, but whole. The sea had sung long enough. For eons it had whispered to the molten dark below, softly, patiently, until the earth began to stir again. Beneath the waves, something ancient was rising, not alive, not yet, but aware, in the quiet way stone remembers heat. The crust, once fragile as glass, thickened with every heartbeat of the planet. Volcanoes pulsed in slow rhythm. Pressure gathered beneath the ocean floor, folding, bending, until the deep began to heave upward. And then, as gently as breath, the first land broke the surface. It was not green, nor brown, nor soft. It was black glass, glimmering with the memory of fire. Each shard steamed in the cool air, hissing where the ocean kissed it, like the earth's own sigh. Land had no trees, no soil, only texture, cracked, blistered, and radiant with silence. The first island was small, a single word in a sentence that would take billions of years to speak. But in that word lived the first memory of solidity. The world now had contrast, water and not water, fluid and stillness, motion and rest. Rain fell on this newborn land, carving soft veins into its sharp face. Each drop carried stories from the sky, minerals from the clouds, whispers from the stars. When they gathered in hollows, tiny pools formed, cradles for what would someday be called soil. The air above the island shimmered. Steam rose in threads, curling like ghostly fingers toward the heavens. Light broke through the mist, and for the first time, the world saw shadow. The sun traced the jagged edges of stone, drawing outlines of time yet to come. Shadow meant direction. Direction meant memory. And the land began to remember. It remembered heat. It remembered pressure. It remembered the long, slow birth from darkness. Every mineral that cooled carried within it a quiet code, a geometry of patience. The rocks were not lifeless. They were simply waiting for translation. Below, the sea continued to breathe against their sides, polishing, reshaping, dissolving. It was not destruction. It was conversation. Water and stone learned each other's language. Tides rewrote shorelines. Erosion became scripture. The first landscapes were born through loss, and loss, the earth would learn, was the foundation of all beauty. The island grew tired of being alone. New eruptions joined it from the deep, molten rivers hardening beside ancient glass. Together they formed an archipelago of beginnings, the planet's first attempt at permanence. Mountains rose not with fury, but with purpose. They reached upward as if trying to remember the stars. The wind met them halfway, softly shaping their faces over endless nights. Even then, the pattern of the future was already being written. Everything that rises will one day return to dust. But for now the land dreamed. It dreamed of rivers that did not yet exist, of forests it could not yet imagine, of feet millions of years from now that would walk upon it, naming the stones without hearing their true song. Lightning split the horizon again, striking the young rock with light so fierce, carved glass within glass. Each strike was a silent rehearsal for memory. Each flash etched new patterns into the planet's growing archive. If one could listen closely, the land was not silent at all. It hummed, a low, continuous vibration, the voice of molten heartbeats beneath miles of crust. That sound would never end. It would only deepen, a subterranean lullaby, keeping time with the turning of the world. As eons passed, the land began to wander. It drifted, cracked, collided. The surface broke into fragments, floating continents not yet named. They met like slow dancers, their collisions writing mountains into existence. Stone folding upon stone, each layer a new verse in the poem of the planet. Rain, relentless and tender, kept falling, filled the cracks, dissolved the edges, carried minerals back to the sea. The ocean accepted everything, even the broken pieces of its own creation. And in those shallow edges where land and water met, something subtle began.
Compounds met sunlight. Minerals met carbon.
And within those mixtures, tiny whispers of life stirred again. The land had remembered itself, but now the earth was learning something deeper, how to share its memory. Each grain of rock carried a spark of the core. Each tide carried whispers of the sky. And in that exchange, possibility grew. At night, the world was dark again, a gentle dark, not the chaos of creation, but the calm of continuity. Stars reflected on tidal pools, their light trembling on the thin film of water. It was as though the universe had found a way to look back at itself. The land exhaled slowly. Steam curled upward like breath. It was ready now to hold forests, to bear rivers, to host the slow unfolding of life. The earth had learned to stand, and standing, it began to dream in silence. Deep within the mantle, the planet still moved like breath, slow, unseen, eternal. The mountains that now crowned the world were not statues, but lungs. They inhaled the sky and exhaled stone. Each peak was a frozen sigh from the planet's core, a moment of stillness carved from motion. Their roots reached deeper than the ocean's floor, anchored in the same fire that had birthed the stars. And beneath them, the earth still pulsed, a heartbeat older than time's first dawn. The wind, born of contrast, began to wander. It carried the scent of stone, dust, and salt, the memory of lightning and the weight of rain. Where it passed, it smoothed the edges of the land, polishing mountains into melody. The first weather systems began their slow dance, a rhythm of evaporation, condensation, and return, the ancient breath of a living sphere. Each gust across the barren rock was an act of remembering. Air moved heat to cold, carving invisible rivers between peaks. Pressure became motion, motion became song, and the world learned to whisper. At first, the sound was lonely, a thin hum winding through canyons of black basalt. But as the surface cooled, as cracks widened into valleys, the wind deepened. It found tone. It found harmony. The first true sound of earth was not thunder, nor rain, but wind carrying itself home. Down in the shadowed valleys, dust began to gather. Each grain was the broken body of an ancient mountain, softened by centuries of weather's touch. Rain carried them downward, layer upon layer, until the world began to form its first soil, thin as a whisper, fragile as memory. This soil was not lifeless. It held within it the ghosts of volcanoes, the ashes of stars, the tears of rain. Every fragment contained the blueprint of endurance. And slowly, beneath a sky still tasting of metal and ozone, the land began to breathe. Steam rose from the cracks between stones, warm and scented faintly of minerals. The air shimmered above them, a mirage of warmth drifting into the cool night. This was the earth's secret respiration, a slow exhale from the depths, feeding the wind that circled its crown. Far beneath, lava still moved like slow thought. It traveled through ancient arteries, feeding the roots of mountains, pushing against the crust in a language of pressure and patience. Sometimes it spoke too loudly, and the ground split open, releasing fire back into the sky. But even that destruction was gentle compared to the chaos that came before. The planet had learned moderation. It burned with awareness now. Lightning still found its way to these new summits, cracked across their spines, etching fleeting constellations into the rock. Each strike fused minerals into new forms, weaving oxygen and metal into intricate threads. Those threads would later become the veins of or the hidden treasure the earth would bury within itself. The mountains became keepers of time. Their layers, built over endless cycles, recorded every breath the planet took. Each line, each fold, was a memory, some of fire, some of flood, some of the quiet in between. At night, the peaks glowed faintly under starlight. The air thinned near their tops, cold and clear as glass. The stars seemed closer there, as if leaning in to listen. The wind sang across the ridges, a lonely hymn to endurance. And below, valleys collected mist, the soft condensation of ancient dreams. The earth's breath could now be felt everywhere. Wind moved heat from equator to pole. Rain returned minerals to sea. Rivers carved memory into stone. The planet was no longer just alive. It was cyclical, aware in rhythm if not in thought. Each motion created balance. Each balance sustained motion. Over time, as the mountains wore down, their dust enriched the shallow pools below. There, under the watchful gaze of starlight, minerals and carbon mingled again. The chemistry of patience resumed. The building blocks of life began another slow rehearsal. Not yet awake, but dreaming. The mountains had done their part. They had exhaled the breath of the deep, and in that breath, seeded the sky, the soil, and the ocean with promise. It would take millions of years still for green to find the courage to grow. But the stage was set. The rhythm of Earth's breathing had found permanence. In time, the mountains would crumble, the valleys would flood, the sea would rise again, and yet something of them would always remain. In the dust carried by wind, in the minerals dissolved in rain, in the faint warmth rising through the ground each night. The breath beneath the mountains would never cease. It would become the quiet heartbeat behind every tree, every storm, every living thing to come. The land had remembered itself, and in remembering, had given the planet its pulse. The first rivers were not born in thunder. They did not roar or crash. They began as whispers, threads of rainwater tracing uncertain paths down young stone. They slipped through cracks, followed gravity's soft persuasion, and gathered into lines of patience. Where they passed, they shaped the earth in secret. Every droplet carried the ghost of a cloud, a memory of the ocean that had sent it. In falling, forgot where it came from, but in flowing, it began to remember. That is what a river truly is, water remembering its way home. At first, the land resisted. It was raw and unyielding, a mosaic of basalt and cooled glass. But time, like water, never argues, persuades. It touches and touches again, until even the hardest stone softens. The rivers cut themselves into the world, their curves deliberate, their motion unhurried. Each twist became an echo of persistence, each valley a story told through erosion. Where they met the sea, they dissolved into silence, their bodies carried back into the endless blue, from which they had first fallen. But in their passage, they left behind veins of fertility, delicate scars filled with promise. The rain followed them faithfully. Clouds gathered over their courses, drawn by the warmth of wet stone. Day after day, cycle after cycle, they returned, never identical, but always familiar. In this endless return, the planet began to find its rhythm. The rivers did not just carve the land, they carried its memory. They lifted minerals from mountain to plain, salt from soil to ocean, stories from high places to low. And in the still pools between currents, something miraculous began. The light, having learned to linger on the surface, now slipped beneath it. It touched particles suspended in the water, dust, carbon, metal, and from that light, a fragile shimmer of chemistry awoke. Molecules began to bond not by chance, but by repetition. Patterns formed, then chains, then whispers of replication. The rivers were no longer mere travelers. They had become cradles. Each droplet carried not only minerals and memory, but the quiet potential of consciousness. If the ocean had been the womb, the rivers were the first lullabies, soft, nurturing, full of rhythm. They sang to the land as they passed, carving lullabies into canyons, humming to the stones until they yielded. Even now, when rivers move through modern soil, they carry echoes of that first song. The sound of running water is the sound of time itself learning to flow. At dusk, mist rose from their banks. It shimmered with the last gold light of the sun, lifting skyward like a promise. The sky, remembering, answered with rain. Thus the eternal conversation continued, sky to mountain, mountain to river, river to sea, and sea to sky again. The world had invented continuity. The rivers deepened as the centuries unfolded. They braided themselves through valleys, merged, divided, became delta and floodplain. Their courses shaped everything. Where air would cool, where clouds would gather, where life, when it finally came, would dare to stand. At night, the rivers glowed faintly beneath the stars, reflecting constellations that had not yet been named. To the sleeping earth, they looked like veins of light, illuminating the body of the planet from within. The stars above and the rivers below, a perfect symmetry of reflection. Sometimes, lightning would find the water, racing down its current, fusing oxygen and hydrogen in bursts of energy. Each spark left behind fragments of new molecules, precursors of what would one day breathe, grow, and remember. But none of it hurried. Life, like a river, does not rush to arrive. It simply continues until being becomes inevitable. In their stillness between rains, the rivers became mirrors. They reflected not just the sky, but the passage of clouds, the ephemeral made visible. The land, once scorched and silent, was now a canvas of reflection. The sky had found a way to see itself in the world it had shaped. Each dawn, the mists rose again, and each evening, they returned as rain. The circle was perfect, not designed, but discovered through patience. The mountains breathed, the rivers dreamed, and the sea waited. The world had found a balance between descent and return. And beneath all of this, the earth's slow heart continued to beat. Heat rose quietly from the core, reminding the surface of its origins. Even in calm, there was fire, Even in silence, there was motion. The rivers did not know they were building the future. They only knew how to move. They carved the earth so that memory could travel. They carried whispers of mountains long vanished, secrets of stars dissolved into dust, echoes of the first rains. And somewhere, in the shadow of a stone canyon, where sunlight met shallow water, a single molecule began to fold differently than before. The first pattern of life's intention, quietly repeating itself in rhythm with the flow. It would be millions of years before it called itself alive. But the rivers already knew. They had dreamed of return since the beginning. Life did not begin with noise. It began with rhythm, with the soft pulse of molecules meeting in the quiet folds of water, where sunlight could only just reach. There, beneath the trembling skin of rivers and seas, the earth's oldest song played on repeat, a pattern so gentle that it seemed accidental, and yet so perfect it became destiny.
Carbon met hydrogen. Nitrogen met patience.
Phosphorus lingered long enough to remember the touch of light, and from those unions came repetition, the first act of creation not born from chaos, but from longing. The first living thing did not breathe air. It breathed time. It took in energy not from flame, but from photons, soft gifts from the sun filtered through water's calm veil. Each one, a small message from the cosmos. Continue. And so it did. It floated, unseen, in a world with no sound but current. It drifted between light and shadow, between warmth and the slow chill of depth. It divided, not to conquer, but to persist. Each division a quiet defiance against oblivion. Each copy a declaration that the universe had remembered how to feel. They were small, so small the sea did not yet know it was full of them. But they moved with intention, and intention is where meaning begins. The light above shimmered through the waves, fracturing into 1,000 pieces of gold. Some of it was caught by these drifting seeds. In that brief capture, energy became memory, and memory became life. No eyes existed to see it, no sound to mark the moment, but it was enough. The silence of the planet had been broken not by thunder, but by persistence. These first beings, fragile as dew, enduring as gravity, were the quiet architects of everything to come. They fed on light and stone, turning sunlight into sugar, sugar into breath, and breath into the first exhalations of oxygen. At first it gathered unnoticed. Invisible bubbles rose through the still water, dissolving back into the sea. But over ages, it accumulated, and with each exhale, the planet's air began to change. The oxygen was not yet kind. To the old chemistry of Earth, it was poison. But poison and possibility are often the same thing, depending on who learns to adapt. The seas turned green with bloom. Billions of microscopic hearts beat in unison, each one a tiny act of defiance. They were weaving the sky's future without ever leaving the water. They did not know it, but they were preparing the world for breath. Light became their sustenance, and in return, they gave the air itself. Perfect exchange, quiet, mutual, eternal. Every wave now shimmered with hidden labor. Every ripple carried the weight of unseen creation. The oceans had become a breathing organism, its surface alive with microscopic suns. The land, still barren, felt their work in the wind. The sky brightened, the clouds shifted tone. Blue deepened across the horizon, the first sign that the planet was changing from within. Night after night, the stars watched their reflection ripple on these living waters. Perhaps they recognized something familiar, perhaps not, but the pattern was the same. Light birthing life, life birthing meaning. The sea had become memory made visible. It stored the world's past in salt, its present in breath, its future in molecules dividing beneath the calm. There were failures, too, countless false starts, fragile chains that broke before they could persist. But failure was not loss. It was refinement. It was evolution, not as a struggle, but as a slow remembering of what worked best. Over eons, these first cells learned to anchor themselves. They clung to rocks, formed mats, and began to shape the very terrain beneath them. Where they grew, minerals accumulated. Layer by layer, they built stone that remembered their touch, fossil reefs older than continents. These were the first monuments, built not by hands, but by breath. And as they worked, something unseen was stirring deeper down. The heat of the Earth's core met the cold of its oceans, and between those extremes, a new kind of chemistry whispered to life. Dark, volcanic vents exhaled minerals and warmth, creating havens of creation far below the light. There, in the black silence, life learned another lesson, that existence did not depend on the sun, could also depend on fire. Two worlds of origin, light and heat, each believing itself alone. But together, they would build a planet that could dream in both day and night. The rivers carried their offspring to the seas. The seas carried their breath to the sky. And the sky, newly rich with oxygen, looked down in wonder at what had begun beneath it. The first breath was not air, but intention, the will to continue. And that will, once ignited, would never sleep again. The light that once danced on the surface of the water now sank deeper, carrying with it a message too vast for words, a message of awakening. First it was scattered. Photons fell into the sea like whispers, touching nothing, meaning nothing. But over time, the sea began to answer. In the shallows, where warmth and light lingered long enough to meet matter, tiny cells gathered like drifting thoughts. They had no eyes, but they could feel the difference between shadow and radiance. They leaned toward the light, slowly, like dreamers reaching toward warmth. And in that reaching, they learned to remember. Memory on a world that had never seen mind began as chemistry. Certain shapes of molecules lasted longer when light touched them. Those shapes passed themselves onward, generation after generation, until endurance became inheritance. That was how the sea began to think, not with thought, but with persistence. The light taught the sea how to store experience, and in doing so, it taught the planet to grow old. Each morning, the same soft golden haze seeped through the waves. Each evening it dimmed into silver. The rhythm of light became a heartbeat, and soon life followed it. Cells divided faster under the sun. They slowed when it sank. Day and night, two halves of a cosmic pulse that shaped every living rhythm to come. Some of these early beings found a secret. They could trap light inside themselves, not with fire, but with color, a quiet, perfect alchemy, turning sunlight into sugar and sugar into survival. The oceans turned green with them. Whole fields of microscopic life shimmered just below the surface, invisible from above, but painting the water with an emerald glow from within. If you could have seen it then, the earth would not yet have looked alive, but it would have breathed differently. The air was changing. A faint trace of oxygen began to stir in the wind, a chemical signature of something profound. That breath was not loud. It was not even meant to be heard, but it marked the first time that life changed the world around it. And that change would never stop. The sea remembered every photon it ever held. Every spark of light that passed through it left a faint trace of energy, like a footstep in soft sand. Over billions of years, those footsteps built pathways, pathways that shaped what life could become. Each wave that rose and fell carried not just water, but history. The ocean became a living archive, storing what the sky had once whispered through light. The color of the sea deepened. What had once been green began to shift toward blue. As oxygen thickened in the air, the sunlight changed its tone. The blue wavelengths lingered longest, and the planet learned to reflect them. From that reflection came beauty. From beauty came awareness. When the first forms of life began to sense the color of their world, they were seeing not just the sea, but their own history written in light. But the story of the light was not only creation. It was also transformation. The same oxygen that gave breath also brought destruction to what could not adapt. The world's early chemistry, rich in iron, methane, and silence, began to rust away. Oceans turned red for a time, as iron met the new air and bled into the sea. It was a quiet apocalypse, a planet cleansing itself through the work of its smallest beings. The Great Oxidation was not a single event. It was a slow revelation. The world's color changed from red to green, and finally to blue. The sky itself grew clear, washed of haze and dust. Clouds brightened, storms softened, and light finally touched land with the same gentleness it had once offered only to the sea. The planet had learned how to breathe. From the surface, you could have watched the reflection of stars trembling in the water, and not known that the same atoms of light were also moving through living cells below. There was no separation anymore. Sky and sea, light and life, they had become one continuous exchange. The ocean carried within it not just life, but the recipe for future worlds, for forests, for lungs, for thought itself. And though none of it had yet taken shape, the foundations were already there. The chemistry of awareness, the language of connection, the slow, rhythmic remembering of the cosmos. If you listen closely to the sound of rain, to the hush of tides, you are hearing that first lesson repeated, how the sea learned to remember light. Every wave that touches the shore is an echo of that moment when matter first met meaning. The blue of the planet is not a color, it is a memory, the memory of light teaching the sea how to hold life without ever needing to speak. There was a time when the sky was not blue. It was heavy, copper and rust, a curtain of iron dust and breathless haze. The light that reached the surface was dim and amber, the kind that made the sea look thick and secretive. It was a world still wrapped in sleep. But something had begun to stir beneath that stillness. The ocean, once only a mirror to the stars, was changing the very air above it. Each faint sigh of oxygen rose slowly through the waves, invisible, delicate, like a whisper the world wasn't yet ready to hear. For eons, those whispers went unnoticed. They collected softly, the way dew gathers before dawn. Then, one day, or perhaps 1 million slow dawns later, the planet exhaled. The transformation was not sudden. It was the kind of change that only deep time allows. Each tiny breath from the sea's ancient dwellers chipped away at the haze above. The air grew thinner, clearer. The color of the world began to shift. What had been red turned gold, and what had been gold turned pale. At last, the sky itself opened, a soft scattering of blue light falling across the surface of the water. It was not merely a change in hue. It was the first moment Earth saw itself. The blue was a sign of revelation, that the atmosphere had cleared, that light could now travel freely, that life had forever altered the air. The planet had taken its first true breath. Imagine the quiet of that era. No leaves to rustle, no bird to fill the dawn with sound, only the long sigh of the sea, and the subtle hum of chemistry. The new air carried oxygen, but also danger. It was a gift wrapped in fire. The same element that gave life could also burn it away. And yet, through that fragile balance, a new kind of resilience was born. Cells learned to use oxygen's power carefully, to take its flame and turn it inward, to build from it energy, endurance, and motion. The age of stillness began to move. The sea, which had once only drifted and dreamed, now pulsed with a deeper rhythm. Currents changed, storms grew, and the chemistry of breath spread like a new language through the water. The great oxidation was not a tragedy, though it ended countless forms of early life. It was a cleansing, a baptism by air. The earth shed its veil of ancient gases, and prepared for what would come next. Iron sank out of the oceans, settling in red layers across the seafloor. Those layers still sleep beneath mountains, a record of that first breath. Carved into stone, they are the lungs of time, rusted, ancient, silent. Each band of iron is a memory, a pulse of oxygen written into the crust of the planet. Geologists still read them like lines of poetry, rhythms of life and death, waves of oxygen rising and fading, as if the planet itself were learning how to inhale. With air came color. The blue of the sky deepened. Sunsets began to paint themselves across the horizon. First pink, then orange, then violet. The world became capable of beauty. Before that, beauty had been hidden, locked within the chemistry of light and salt. Now it spilled into the open sky, soft and endless, and in that openness, a new potential was born, the union of air and sea. Raindrops began to fall differently. They no longer carried only acid and ash. They carried oxygen, carried memory, carried the promise of complexity. Each drop that returned to the ocean brought with it a fragment of the sky. Each wave that rose to meet the rain carried the memory of the deep. Together they began to write the long dialogue between sea and air, a dialogue that still continues in every breath taken by every living thing. The blue world was now awake, and yet it was still alone. No eye had yet opened to witness it. No voice had yet called it home. The silence was still complete, but it was no longer empty. Within that silence, potential shimmered, the kind of potential that waits quietly, like a seed buried in light. The oceans, vast and alive, were preparing for something they could not yet imagine. Multicellular life, movement, perception, the slow unfolding of awareness. The breath of the planet had set everything in motion. And from that motion, destiny began to take shape. Even now, when the wind moves across the sea, carries that same echo, the breath that turned a lifeless sky blue. Each gust is a whisper from that first awakening, a reminder that every living thing is part of that ancient inhalation. The planet breathes through us, as it once breathed through water, and every exhale we give back to the world is a continuation of that first sigh, drawn billions of years ago beneath a sky of fire. Movement began as a tremor, not in the sky, nor in the tides, but within the planet's molten heart. For so long, Earth had only known stillness and cycle. Light fell, waves turned, time circled quietly. But then, deep beneath the crust, a slow churning began. It was not violent. It was patient, a restlessness older than mountains, older even than form. The mantle stirred like a sleeping creature, rolling toward consciousness. Heat rose, rocks softened, and continents, still unborn, shifted as though they were dreaming of themselves. That motion, once begun, would never stop. It was the heartbeat of geology, a rhythm that would write the story of every land, every ocean, every breath. The oceans followed that pulse. Currents deepened, eddies swirled through the blue. Water began to travel, carrying warmth, carrying salt, carrying memory. Where once the sea had been uniform, now it had moods. It was calm in one place, restless in another. It began to mirror the mind it would one day nurture, a balance of calm and current, of silence and change. And beneath that moving surface, life began to move too, started small, a shift of cell against cell, a drift that became a glide. Somewhere in the shallows, tiny filaments quivered, sensing the difference between light and shadow, warmth and cold. They began to move toward the warmth. It was not thought, but something like yearning. And from that yearning, motion was born. For the first time, life followed something other than chemistry, followed desire, the desire for light, for continuation, for something more. That single act, a cell moving toward what it needed, changed everything. It was the beginning of agency, the faintest spark of will. The ocean that had once only drifted, now held intention. The planet felt it too. It responded with storms. Thunderheads began to rise higher. Winds swept across open seas. The rain became heavier, carving paths through the newborn landmasses that were beginning to rise from the ocean floor. Islands formed, dark and raw, still steaming from the planet's heat. The first continents were not calm. They were restless, breathing like embers in the dark. And the water surrounded them, like thought surrounding a dream, shaping, dissolving, then shaping again. The dance between rock and sea became the great conversation of the planet. It would go on forever, erasing and rewriting its own words. Movement created memory. Each shift of current, each birth of land, each ripple of life, all of it was recorded in sediment, in mineral, in the slow folding of time. The earth was no longer only a stage. It was a living participant. It was aware of its own motion, not through consciousness, but through continuity. And as the continents drifted apart, they began to paint patterns upon the planet's skin. Their boundaries moved like tectonic sighs, the way thoughts shift in sleep. The first supercontinent, perhaps Volbara, perhaps something even older, rose from the deep and felt sunlight for the first time. No creature watched it happen. No sound marked its emergence. But the sea felt the difference. Tides broke differently. The winds redirected. The earth's rhythm changed its tempo. And that was enough. With land came shadow. And in the shadow, life discovered contrast. Beneath rocks and along tidal pools, cells began to seek shelter, to cling, to adapt. In doing so, they found new ways to exist. Movement was no longer only about reaching light. It was about surviving its absence. Day and night became boundaries of behavior. Light and dark became the first form of choice. And from that choice, the future unfolded. The planet had given life the gift of movement. Life, in return, gave the planet the gift of purpose. If one could have stood then, on the edge of a steaming volcanic island, beneath a new blue sky, and looked across that trembling horizon, the world would have looked alive, not with creatures, not yet, but with motion, with the hum of forming rivers, with the pulse of tectonic breaths, with the faint glitter of plankton drifting toward the sun. It was an earth learning to think through rhythm. The first shadows that moved beneath the water were not just alive, they were the memory of the planet moving within itself. Even now, when waves meet stone, the sound they make is not only erosion, it is recognition. The sea remembers the first time it touched land. The land remembers the sea that made it. And between them, a timeless promise continues. To move, to change, to remember. The land rose not in thunder, but in a whisper that took millions of years to speak. A whisper shaped by pressure, by the weight of oceans longing to release their burden. Mountains were not born in moments. They were remembered into being, drawn upward by the slow thought of the planet beneath them. The crust thickened, folding upon itself like parchment catching fire from within. Every inch of uplift carried the memory of the sea that once covered it. Each grain of stone was forged from silt, each ridge built from what the tides had left behind. To rise was not rebellion. It was memory in reverse, the ocean's own reflection returning to the surface as stone. The first continents gleamed dark and wet under a newborn sun. They were not green, not soft, not ready for footsteps. They were vast mosaics of black basalt and volcanic glass, shining like obsidian mirrors to the light above. Rain fell upon them endlessly, for thousands of years at a time. The clouds wept over that rough skin of earth, turning fire to clay, dust to soil, and silence into the first murmur of rivers. Where water met heat, minerals dissolved, and life found foothold. In the smallest cracks, between crystals and ash, microbes clung to warmth and began the long work of transformation. a slow greening, not yet visible, but inevitable. The land was still learning how to endure the sky. Wind sculpted it with patience. Lightning touched it with memory. And through this exchange, a new kind of world began to take shape, a realm of pattern and permanence. The planet, once fluid, was learning the art of solidity. But even in stone, motion continued. Mountains rose and fell in slow motion. Volcanoes bled rivers of fire into the sea, and the sea, ever forgiving, took them back. Nothing was separate yet. Water carved stone. Stone fed minerals to water, and through that exchange, the chemistry of possibility grew richer. Each rainfall carried whispers of iron, traces of carbon, the breath of volcanoes, the salt of ancient tides. Together they formed the first long chain of nourishment, a cycle that would one day sustain forests, animals, thought. But for now, it was only beginning, the quiet invention of abundance. The continents were like sleeping giants, shifting under the weight of their own dreams. Tectonic plates pressed and sighed beneath the crust, their friction creating mountains that reached higher with each breath. Those first mountains were bare, but they were radiant in their own silence. The sunlight scattered on their slopes like 1,000 quiet stars, and when night came, they reflected starlight back into the heavens, as if returning what they had borrowed. In those reflections, the universe saw itself mirrored. In dust, in stone, in stillness, the earth had become not just a planet, but a canvas for light. The rains did not stop. They fell without end, without memory, without mercy. Each drop broke the rock a little more, wearing grooves into the mountainsides, opening valleys where rivers would one day run. Over time, those valleys filled with sediment, and from that sediment came life's next stage: nutrients, shelter, texture. It was in those newborn basins that shallow inland seas began to form, teeming with minerals and the echoes of ancient tides. The water had found new homes inland, and with it brought life further from the coast. The sea had begun to teach the land how to live. The air thickened with new vapors. Methane dwindled. Oxygen grew bold. Lightning struck and left traces of nitrogen in the soil, fertilizing a future not yet imagined. The land, once lifeless, now held the ingredients of breath. Still invisible, still microscopic. But everything was there, waiting for light to touch it the right way. It would be millions of years before forests rose where these mountains stood, before rivers carried songs, before eyes opened to see the blue of the sky reflected in lakes below. But the pattern had already been written. The world was becoming fertile. In the haze of the Archean dawn, the continents shone like islands of memory. Amid an ocean that had no edges, mist clung to their edges. Rivers traced new paths toward unseen seas. And somewhere in that stillness, the planet paused, as if to admire its own creation. The land had risen from the sea, but the sea still ruled its heart. Every rock was soaked in salt. Every stone remembered drowning. Even the wind smelled faintly of brine. If one were to listen then, to stand upon a ridge of molten stone cooling beneath the stars, the sound of rain would have been the only voice. Soft, relentless, eternal. It was the first lullaby of land, the sound of water teaching stone to yield, teaching it how to become soil, teaching it how to hold life someday. That is why, even now, mountains sigh when it rains. They remember the beginning. They remember being born from ocean and storm, and they wait patiently for life to return to them, to climb them, to breathe upon them once more. After the fire and rain, after the continents rose from their own reflection, the planet grew quiet again. It was a silence not of emptiness, but of balance. The world had found its rhythm. Heat from below met cool from above. The oceans circled in patience, and the land finally began to rest. The earth was dreaming again, but this dream was long and deliberate. It was the dream of form. The continents drifted through that slow sleep, like ships upon a dark and endless tide. They moved only inches in a century, yet in that movement, they redrew the face of the world. It was during this long, drowsy wandering that the planet began to breathe in patterns. Carbon rose into the sky, fell into the sea, and returned again to stone. Mountains lifted and eroded, their dust feeding the very oceans that had shaped them. Nothing was lost, only changed, each cycle a reminder that permanence was an illusion. In the age of deep time, even silence was motion. The air had softened by then. The early violence of storms had mellowed into rhythm. Clouds drifted slower. Rain fell in intervals, gentle, nourishing, cyclical. Light scattered differently too. It bent around moisture, turning horizons into soft halos of gold. There were no eyes yet to see this beauty, but the beauty existed all the same. That is what made it sacred. Beauty for no witness, pattern for no purpose, only the planet delighting quietly in its own creation. The crust of the world thickened. Continents anchored themselves into the deep mantle, steady, ancient, enduring. Geologists, eons later, would name these stable cores cratons. But to the planet itself, they were memory, the bones of its first dream. Each craton held within it the story of volcano and ocean, pressure and release, and in their layered silence, they stored the memory of every age before. They were the continent's heartbeats, slow, constant, the foundation of all that would ever rise. During this long hush, the world's chemistry settled into harmony. The seas no longer boiled, the sky no longer burned. For the first time, Earth was temperate, capable of stillness without dying. It was an equilibrium so fragile that the planet itself seemed to hold its breath. In that quiet, life waited, not impatiently, not urgently, but the way seeds wait beneath snow, dormant, certain, timeless. And in this patience, something miraculous occurred. The cycles of light and shadow, heat and cold, pressure and release, they began to weave complexity, not in sudden leaps, but in whispers. Cells merged and divided in new ways. Some began to live together, sharing structure, sharing breath. What had once been a sea of solitary beings was now becoming a symphony of cooperation. The first multicellular life did not bloom in triumph. It unfolded quietly, like dusk gathering on the horizon. It was the next dream of the planet, still unspoken, but already alive. The continents watched this from their ancient stillness. Their rivers deepened, Their shores lengthened, their mountains softened into age. Each change left an echo. Each echo left a fossil, not always of life, but of memory. There are rocks on Earth that still hum faintly with these first vibrations, minerals aligned with magnetic fields long vanished. Iron turned to stone during that patient drift. They are the whispers of time, and the earth has never forgotten them. The great deep time was not empty. It was full of waiting. Continents approached one another, then parted again. Volcanoes came and went. Comets brushed the atmosphere, their dust scattering silver light over the seas. Each event, no matter how vast, was absorbed into the same dreamlike continuity. Nothing startled the planet anymore. It had learned the art of endurance. If the earlier ages were about survival, this one was about memory, the kind of memory that lives not in thought, but in structure, in temperature, in orbit, in silence. And so, the Earth slept lightly for 1 billion years. Its surface shifted, its colors deepened, its oceans turned clearer, its air more breathable. It was preparing itself, though it did not know for what. Beneath that calm, possibility thickened. In the deep, in the dark, in the unseen. The planet was not resting. It was rehearsing. Something extraordinary was coming, and the earth, in its long and patient dreaming, was almost ready to awaken again. The world had been quiet for a very long time. Continents drifted, seas deepened, the air softened, and somewhere within that stillness, in the darkness between tides, the first whispers began. They were not words, nor thoughts, nor anything that could yet be called life as we know it. They were exchanges, tiny pulses between cells, patterns of touch and release, signals without language. It was the ocean's first murmur of awareness. For billions of years, life had been simple, single cells drifting through warmth and mineral light. They absorbed, divided, and drifted again. They did not know one another, and yet they were everywhere, woven into every current and shadow. But now something changed. Certain cells began to stay together after dividing. Instead of drifting apart, they clung. They shared protection, shared food, shared rhythm, and in that cooperation, a new kind of existence unfolded. This was not intelligence. It was resonance. One cell reacted to another's breath, and in turn that breath became a pattern. For the first time, the planet had structure that could remember. The ancient seas glowed faintly at night then. Scientists call it bioluminescence. But to the dreaming Earth, it was something else, the first flicker of consciousness in the dark. Each glow a signal, each signal a whisper of presence. Imagine a world without eyes, only light meeting light, one spark answering another. It was communication before comprehension, instinct before identity. The ocean itself seemed alive with quiet thought. These first colonies grew in shapes both strange and beautiful. Filaments, sheets, spirals, and spheres, patterns that repeated through tides and time. When sunlight passed through them, it made living mosaics, like stained glass drifting beneath the waves. Each organism was simple, yet together they formed networks, and through those networks, the first sense of connection appeared. A current moved, a shadow shifted, and somewhere, deep within, Cells felt it, not understood, but felt. And in that faint recognition, the boundary between self and world grew just a little thinner. The earth was listening too. The chemistry of the atmosphere adjusted, oxygen whispering into balance. Volcanoes softened their eruptions, giving way to slow-breathing vents on the seafloor. Each vent released minerals, and life gathered there, feeding, changing, remembering. It was as though the planet itself was feeding its children's stories through the dark. Time moved differently then. 1,000 years passed like a breath, 1,000,000 years a heartbeat, and yet every cell, every colony was carrying the legacy of that long waiting. Evolution, in its quiet precision, was weaving a tapestry of possibilities. Some cells learned to move, some learned to eat sunlight, some began to sense pressure, heat, direction. The first nervous impulses, the first delicate coordination, were forming in that gentle darkness. Life was beginning to respond, and still there was no sound, only the rhythm of currents, the soft hiss of hydrothermal plumes, the unhurried beat of planetary time. But within that silence, the pattern deepened. The ocean had become a library, and each living thing a page. Every interaction, every shared nutrient, was a sentence in a growing book, one that told not of survival, but of connection. Eventually, some of these living colonies began to build shapes with purpose. They created tiny chambers and filaments, passages where water could flow, light could touch, and nutrients could gather. These were the first tissues, the beginnings of body. They did not yet know hunger or fear, but they knew harmony, and in their harmony, they created beauty, not the beauty of color or sound, but of function, a pattern that felt right, because it fit perfectly within the whole. If you could have stood there, at the edge of one of those shallow seas, under a pale, ancient sky, you would have seen nothing. The waves would have looked still, the water dark and empty, and yet beneath that stillness, the entire ocean was learning how to feel. Each tide was an experiment, each current a conversation. Life was teaching itself how to notice. The whispers continued. They passed from cell to cell, from structure to structure, becoming more intricate, more alive, and somewhere in that soft exchange, something extraordinary stirred, the first awareness of being. Not I exist, but the faintest recognition of continuity, that what happened before might influence what comes next. It was the birth of time in the mind of life. Above, the continents shifted again. Mountains rose and fell. The wind carried minerals to the sea, feeding the very beings that were learning to perceive it. The planet and its children were no longer separate. They were a single, breathing ecosystem, stone, air, water, and cell, in a slow, endless conversation. And in that great, quiet exchange, the universe leaned closer. Stars reflected in the water. The moon's pull shaped tides into rhythm. Everything, the cosmic, the cellular, the unseen, was synchronized. Awareness was no longer a spark. It was a pulse, a gentle heartbeat through all creation. Before there were eyes, there was only the shimmer. Light slid down into the sea, breaking into fragments of color that no being could yet perceive. It moved through water like a rumor, untouched, unmeasured, unseen. But still the ocean remembered. Each photon left a trace, a warmth that lingered, a rhythm that returned every dawn. And in that repetition, something inside the drifting cells began to change. They started to notice. It began not with vision, but with sensation, a quiet preference for brightness. Those who drifted nearer the sunlit surface found life a little easier, warmth more generous, energy more abundant. So they stayed. Generation after generation, they rose with the dawn and fell with the dusk. Their descendants inherited that subtle pull toward light. And over eons, what was once mere instinct became something more. The first pigments were born, tiny molecules able to trap sunlight and store its memory. They painted the earliest organisms in hues unseen, reds of rusted iron, greens of ancient chlorophyll, pale blues from the breath of the sea. To the planet it was chemistry, to time it was art. Each cell became a window, each pigment a fragment of recollection. When light touched them, they responded. When darkness came, they waited, and thus began the first dialogue. Between day and night, the ocean learned rhythm. Life pulsed with it. Day became the inhale, night the exhale. The planet was breathing. In those soft exchanges between light and life, something sacred unfolded, the first awareness of change. Until then, existence had been static, an endless gray of motion without meaning. But now, with light and shadow alternating above, the world had pattern. And where there is pattern, memory soon follows. Those early beings did not see, but they could sense when light touched them. They could tell when it returned after its absence. And that small distinction between brightness and its loss was the dawn of perception itself. They began to move toward it, chasing warmth across the currents, aligning themselves with the eternal return of the sun. It was not thought, not desire, but recognition, a soft echo in the fabric of life that whispered, "The light comes back." From this faint sensitivity, something miraculous emerged. Specialized pigments gathered into clusters, tiny regions more attuned to brightness than others. These would one day become eyes, but for now, they were proto-eyes, simple shadows of what vision would be. Still, they carried a power that was profound. They gave the ocean color, not to the world itself, but to the story life told about it. Where before there had been only drifting, there was now orientation. Where before there had been endless night, there was now a direction toward the light. The earth, ever silent, seemed to watch this unfolding with quiet pride. Mountains eroded into rivers, rivers spilled into seas, and all the while, these microscopic pioneers were painting the story of perception. In tones too small to see, sunlight became language, darkness, punctuation. The ocean was writing poetry with photons. Time thickened again. The air grew clearer, oxygen rising like invisible glass. More complex organisms appeared, their bodies layered and coordinated, their surfaces rippling with the shimmer of those ancient pigments. And in one corner of the world, a cluster of cells folded inward, forming a small hollow, a curve where light could gather and focus. That curve became an eye. It was crude at first, just a pit that sensed brightness and shadow. but it was enough to know when the sun rose, when predators approached, when the world shifted from safety to danger. The earth had found a way to see itself. Imagine it, a single spark of sunlight, traveling 93 million miles, to fall upon a droplet of life that could feel its warmth and respond. That moment, silent, unnoticed, eternal, was the birth of vision. And with vision came awareness not only of the world, but of its passing. The sun would rise, the sun would fall. Patterns became cycles, cycles became time, and time became memory. The ocean had given birth to sight, and sight had given birth to remembering. In those endless days and nights, light and darkness danced across the planet's surface. The first eyes watched, and though they did not understand, they began to feel the rhythm of becoming. The sun was no longer a mystery. It was a companion, a pulse from the heavens that called to the pulse within the sea. And so the story of perception continued, a soft unfolding of light meeting life, of awareness deepening through the slow grace of evolution. The world was learning how to look back at itself. But light, like memory, can be both a gift and a burden. For with sight came the realization of shadow, and from shadow, the first sense of loss. When the sun sank and darkness claimed the sea, the new eyes closed, and in that closing was born a new feeling, the yearning for return. Thus, life learned longing, and in that longing, the first dream was born. The sea was no longer empty. It breathed in color now, the blue of its depths, the gold of the shallows, the pale shimmer of light that touched life and turned it radiant. In that slow illumination, the world began to build its first architecture. Stone not made by rivers, but by the touch of living things. Tiny beings, countless and fragile, settled upon one another, weaving calcium into pattern, into rhythm, into home. And thus the first reefs were born. They did not begin as monuments. They began as whispers, a single layer of tiny skeletons, white as salt, fragile as thought. Each generation built upon the remains of the last. And through this devotion to permanence, the ocean found its first way to remember. Coral became the diary of the sea. Every storm, every shift of current, every breath of temperature was etched into its slow-growing stone. It was not writing, but recording, a memory kept in mineral, line after line, century after century. When the tides withdrew, the reefs glimmered like bone beneath the sun. And when the waters returned, they came alive again, each crevice filling with color and movement. Fish, soft-bodied and shimmering, found refuge in their chambers. Worms and shells, crabs and early mollusks, turned the coral labyrinth into the first great city of life. It was an orchestra without sound, a stillness alive with motion. Each breath of the reef was both life and death, the builders dying to form shelter for those yet to come. And in that endless exchange, Earth learned the sacred art of continuity. The reefs did not merely exist. They dreamed. Each layer grew upward toward light, as if chasing the sun's reflection upon the waves. In their stony spirals, there was intent, the slow yearning of the living, to reach what they could not touch. In the language of coral, Growth was worship. Stillness was memory. Death was transformation. They did not forget. They became the forgetting, the kind that carries everything within it, like a shell containing the echo of its sea. Through the ages, reefs expanded into walls, walls into continents of color. They wrapped around coastlines, like fragile crowns, marking the edges where land met eternity. From above, they looked like veins, the blue heartlines of the planet itself. And through their labyrinths, the ocean whispered its long, unbroken prayer. Even when mountains fell, when glaciers carved valleys, when stars dimmed and seas rose, the coral remained, recording it all, each band within its structure, a timestamp of ancient breath, each pulse of growth, a syllable in Earth's long recitation of memory. If one were to listen closely enough, to place an ear upon the ancient reef, perhaps the sound of it would not be silence. Perhaps it would hum, a deep, low resonance of calcium and tide, the vibration of time folding into itself. For coral does not decay quickly. It endures. It holds within its skeleton the imprint of light, the chemistry of ancient seas, the trace of creatures long dissolved. And when those who study them today cut through their layers, they see not just stone, but time itself, preserved in rhythm and patience. There is something profoundly human in the way coral remembers, not through thought, but through repetition, through the act of being again and again, in the same quiet devotion. Every layer says, I was here once. Every ridge answers, and I remember. The reef does not tell stories with beginnings or endings. It tells them as the earth does, in cycles, in patterns, in echoes. What is gone returns in another form, and what remains does not remain the same. It is continuity, not permanence, that defines eternity. The reef became a boundary between what lives and what lasts. Soft creatures built hard worlds, and in those worlds, the future found its foundation. When the land began to rise, the reefs were left behind, fossilized monuments beneath what would one day be mountain. And those mountains still carry them. In their limestone hearts, coral dreams are preserved, millions of years old, untouched by sun or sea. Even now, each fossil is a breath that never ended, a pulse of ocean still trapped in stone. Sometimes, when the world grows quiet and waves press against distant cliffs, you can almost hear it, the faint mineral sigh of an ancient reef, still remembering the sea. Its builders are long gone, their colors faded, their voices dissolved, but their memory remains, singing through the planet's crust. A lullaby older than language says simply, all that is lost becomes the foundation of what will be. And in that truth, Earth continued to dream. The ocean had dreamed long enough. Now it was the land's turn to wake. For billions of years, continents had been shifting in silence. Vast slabs of memory, drifting like thought across the mantle's slow heartbeat. They were the sleeping shoulders of Earth, rising and falling beneath the weight of clouds and tides. But something ancient stirred within the shallows, a soft greening, faint exhale. It began at the edges, where salt water met sunlight and patience, where the sea's ancient builders, bacteria and algae, had already learned to speak with the sky through the language of oxygen. Now that language began to write upon the land. Moist stones were the first to change. Microscopic films of life, dark, glistening mats of cyanobacteria, crept over rock like thought across a sleeping mind. They grew in patterns, layer upon layer, each one leaving behind a whisper of carbon, a trace of breath. These were the first lungs of the land, silent, primitive, enduring. They did not move, and yet they transformed everything. Their slow exhalations filled the air with oxygen. Their shadows cooled the rock. Their remains turned dust into soil. The land was beginning to breathe back. Rain fell differently now. It did not simply carve stone. It nourished it. Each drop carried minerals, seeds of chemistry waiting for life's touch. And when the rain mingled with those early colonies, it awakened something the ocean had long prepared: persistence. No longer was life content to drift. It clung, it endured, it reached upward. In those quiet shallows, the first mosses began to take hold. Tiny, green, trembling things, soft enough to drink the mist, strong enough to reshape the world. They spread like memory, over stone, through cracks, across the bones of dead coral risen into limestone cliffs. The color of the planet shifted. What had once been gray and gold and rust became dusted with emerald, a green so ancient it could be called the color of hope. With this greening came change. The air thickened with new breath, the ground softened underfoot, and rivers began to run differently, guided not by stone, but by root. The land was no longer silent. It whispered in the language of photosynthesis, light becoming life, life becoming atmosphere. In this new symphony of growth, time slowed again. Millions of years passed like a long inhalation, and during that breath, plants learned structure. They grew stems, and leaves, and veins, channels through which water and sunlight could flow like memory. They reached upward not to escape the ground, but to touch the light that had once only belonged to the sea. And the earth, ever patient, allowed them to rise. Forests began not as forests, but as whispers of shadow, clumps of ferns, spindly trunks, the first trees made of lignin, a substance that could resist decay, holding form long after death. The air was thick and warm then, heavy with vapor and promise. Every leaf was an experiment in breathing, every gust of wind a lesson in letting go. And the land learned balance. For every new breath of oxygen, a counterbalance of carbon. For every death, a return to soil. The cycle that began in the ocean had now taken root upon the continents. The planet had found rhythm again. If one could have stood there, in those early forests, the sound would have been unlike anything now. The rain was softer, thicker. The wind carried no bird song, only the quiet percussion of leaves whispering secrets to the mist. The ground exhaled, the sky listened, and in that dialogue between above and below, Earth became something new, a breathing organism, alive from crust to cloud. The rise of land plants changed everything. They drew down carbon from the air, cooling the world. The atmosphere cleared. The stars grew sharper in the night sky. The balance of light and dark had shifted again. This time, not within the ocean's depths, but upon the open skin of continents. The world no longer belonged to water alone. It had become a partnership, a duet between sea and soil, each exhaling what the other required to live. And still, the memory of the ocean remained within every leaf. The rhythm of tides lingered in the rise and fall of sap, in the daily blooming and closing of petals, in the slow turning of plants toward the sun. The land had not escaped the sea. It had simply learned to carry it within. Every root was an echo of coral. Every leaf, a distant descendant of plankton. Every gust of wind, a wave that forgot its water. In this way, the planet did not change, it continued. Life was simply finding new ways to remember where it began. And so, the continents began to dream. They were no longer silent witnesses to the sea's song. They had become part of the melody, breathing, eroding, growing, dying, and breathing again. Each mountain exhaled minerals into rivers. Each forest inhaled sunlight into life. And the cycle of remembering deepened. The Earth was no longer just a planet. It was a living archive, one that wrote its autobiography. In air and stone, the world had changed its color, and now it would change its sound. For the first time since oceans formed, silence had begun to fracture. The wind moved through fern canopies, brushing over damp leaves and hollow trunks, making tones that were not yet music, but hinted at it, a deep rustle, a trembling hum, the earliest voice of land. And through that living stillness, life stirred again. Creatures that had once known only the weightless cradle of water began to press against the edge of the tide. Their gills trembled in the foreign air. Their fins twitched with purpose. They did not yet know why they reached upward, only that something called them. Perhaps it was the scent of the new world. Wet soil, fresh moss, sunlight unbroken by waves. Perhaps it was the pull of oxygen, so rich it shimmered invisibly above the shallows. Whatever it was, life followed it. One heartbeat at a time, climbed. The first steps were awkward, dragged by fins that remembered fluid grace but not weight. Bodies pressed against mud, leaving trails that would one day become fossils, signatures of courage written in silt. And when those early amphibians reached the air, something astonishing happened. They breathed. The air was heavy, thick with moisture and mystery, but it entered them nonetheless, filling ancient lungs that had waited millennia to awaken. The world itself seemed to pause. The ocean had taught them rhythm. Now the land taught them silence between breaths. With that first inhale, Earth gained a new dimension of sound, the subtle vibration of lungs exhaling. Not words, not yet, but the tone of life living against gravity, the soft murmur of survival becoming song. Every breath was a note, and together they created the planet's first symphony, a chorus of frogs beneath primordial ferns, insects drumming against the air, winds learning to carry life's heartbeat through forests of time. The sea had its music, currents, bubbles, songs of whales that would come later. But this was something different. This was the sound of the planet speaking to itself. The air trembled with this new conversation. Echoes stretched through valleys, ricocheting from stone to leaf to wing. And soon wings themselves appeared. From the water's edge rose creatures lighter than their ancestors, their limbs reshaped by necessity, their lungs accustomed to the freedom of air. They fluttered awkwardly at first, then elegantly. The insects became architects of vibration, their bodies tuned to the frequencies of wind and heat. They filled the world with a hum so constant that the sky itself seemed to vibrate with awareness. The earth had learned to sing. This was not music for pleasure. It was music for existence, calls to find one another, rhythms to ward off danger, patterns of sound that carried intention before language was born. Every vibration was a message, every pause a breath of understanding. The forest listened, the soil listened, even the stones seemed to absorb the resonance, as if eager to keep a record of this new form of communication. And thus, the story of sound became the story of memory once more. The first true voices followed soon after. Small, tentative sounds, like wind passing through reeds. But within those vibrations, something more profound stirred. Emotion, fear, recognition, curiosity, perhaps even wonder. These were not just instincts anymore. They were expressions. And in the quiet folds of time, they began to shape meaning. The earth, once silent for billions of years, was now filled with breath that spoke back. The sound of rain became applause against leaves. The crack of thunder, the percussion of the heavens. Winds carried scents like melodies. The world was composing itself, and each creature was an instrument in that orchestra. From the gentle croak of amphibians, to the rhythmic clicking of ancient insects, to the sighing of plants releasing oxygen under starlight. Life and air had become inseparable. Each breath born from the ocean's ancient whisper now became a verse in the song of the land. It was as if the planet had waited for something to break its silence, not violently, but tenderly. Through vibration, the universe began to hear itself think. In this vast new music, some sounds began to linger longer than others. Echoes, the first reverberations of memory made audible. An amphibian's call bouncing off stone, a rustle repeating through the valley, a hum held too long by the wind. These were the beginnings of rhythm, the first hints of pattern within sound. And pattern, as always, led to consciousness. The planet had not only learned to breathe, it had learned to listen. When night fell, the sounds softened again. The forests exhaled cool mist, and the air filled with the low chant of unseen creatures, calling to one another across the dark. It was not yet language, but it was close. Each tone was a bridge across distance, a declaration of presence. I am here, and perhaps, within the spaces between those calls, the world answered back, I remember.